This video is a response to a video I saw posted by Aron, who is an atheist who seems to have a bone to pick with Christianity. The video is titled, How Paleontology Disproves Noah's Flood. Before we get into this video, I want to give a definition of terms. Paleontology is the branch of science concerned with the fossils of animals and plants. To disprove means to prove that something is false. Synonyms are refute, prove false, falsify, debunk, negate, invalidate, contradict, confounds, controvert, discredit. So in light of our definitions, it seems that Aron wants to use the science dealing with fossils to refute, debunk, or prove false the biblical account of the flood. But before we even get a chance to listen to what he has to say, I can already see that he's committed what they call in philosophy a non sequitur, which is a logical fallacy when the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premise or previous statement. Let me explain. Noah's flood has great explanatory scope, which means it explains a large set of data. For example, it explains the Grand Canyon and other canyons, the mid-oceanic ridge, continental shelves and slopes, ocean trenches in the Ring of Fire, earthquakes, magnetic variations on the ocean floor, submarine canyons, coal and oil, methane hydrates, the Ice Age, frozen mammoths, major mountain ranges, overthrust, volcanoes and lava, geometric heat, strata and layered fossils, limestone, metamorphic rock, plateaus, the moho, sword domes, changing axis tilts, comets, asteroids, and meteoroids. So if we were to cross off strata and layered fossils, coal and oil, and frozen mammoths from this list, for argument's sake, there will still be a long list of other data that the flood explains. So the idea that proving that the fossil records are not related to the flood somehow disproves the flood is fallacious reasoning. But I'm going to show grace and forgive this blunder and go ahead and listen to what he has to say.
Who knows how many species that we don't know about today because their fossils were uncovered but discarded by folks who didn't notice the significance of what had just passed through their fingers. It was different with invertebrates, though, because they were usually recognizable seashells or impressions of other aquatic life forms, not that different from what we have today. So when people started to figure out that fossils were the remains of living things cast in stone, it made sense to imagine a global flood as the reason why fossils of marine animals were found so high up on dry land. They didn't yet realize that sea levels rise and fall, that the land heaves up and subsides in an oscillation similar to the tides coming and going, but on a larger and slower scale. They didn't know about tectonic plates pushing what was once a seafloor upward into a high mountain slope. They didn't know that the earth is dynamic, changing and moving all the time, albeit very slowly. And they had no idea yet how very old the world would prove to be until they began to recognize fossils of things that no one had ever seen alive.
He says when people realized that these fossils were the remains of living things cast in stone, it made sense to imagine a global flood as the reason why fossils of marine animals were found so high up on dry land. So he brushes off inductive reasoning as just imagination. Oh, they just imagined that these marine fossils being found on top of mountains were due to the flood, as if they were reasoning from effect to cause as opposed to from cause to effect. Then he turns around and uses inductive reasoning to infer that rising tides and tectonic plates pushing up the ocean floors were the cause. At best, he has two competing ideas seeking to explain the data. This in no way refutes the flood. It's actually hypocritical to brush off the inductive reasoning of creationists while using inductive reasoning to support his presuppositions. Again, I'll have to extend grace and forgive Mr. Ra for the hypocrisy.
These early geologists initially thought that they would find evidence of Noah's flood, but what they found instead was that the rocks were in layers called strata, that certain types of fossil shells and such were only found below a certain depth in the older rocks, and that modern-day animals only appear in the highest layers, which of course were laid down more recently. Already that creates a curious and compelling quandary.
Aron now asserts that early geologists went searching for evidence for Noah's flood, but what they found instead was that the rocks were in layers called strata. This is circular reasoning. Aron starts off with the presupposition that the strata was not evidence for the flood, but for evolution. But instead of proving the point, he just asserts it. The title of the video is How Paleontology Disproves the Flood. So I'll just assert that instead of evidence for the flood, the rocks were in layers called strata. Did I miss something? And then he wanted to claim that the certain types of strata, shells and such, were only found in older layers, and modern day animals only appear in the highest layers. Again, this is circular reasoning. What are modern day animals? He starts with the assumption that evolution is true and says modern day animals are in the highest layers. Should I assume that by modern day animals, that would mean animals that are still living today? There are shellfish, jellyfish, starfish, finfish, and worms in the older layers which seem to resemble what we see today. And there is no evidence that the older version are less sophisticated than their representatives that are alive today. It's a well-known fact that trilobites, which are extinct and found in the so-called older layer, which should represent simple and less evolved forms of life, had compound eyes that were the most sophisticated and complex vision systems of any creature that has ever lived.
Their abundant fossils have made it possible for detailed research to be conducted on the trilobites' eyes. This structure is made up of hundreds of tiny combs, each one of which contains a double lens. This structure is a marvel of creation. The trilobite's eye is the earliest known eye on Earth and definitely refutes the Darwinist claim that living things evolved from the simple to the complex. On this subject, David Raup, a University of Chicago paleontologist, says that the trilobites used an optimal design which would require a well-trained and imaginative optical engineer to develop today. In addition, this same ocular system has survived right down to the present day, unchanged over 530 million years, and can still be seen in such insects as bees and dragonflies. According to the theory of evolution, species have evolved from simple forms to more complex ones. Yet there are no other complex forms prior to trilobites and other Cambrian creatures, which appeared suddenly. Coming into being with no forerunners preceding them. The British zoologist Richard Dawkins, the best-known contemporary proponent of the theory of evolution, makes the following confession. It is as though they, Cambrian creatures, were just planted there, without any evolutionary history. This totally invalidates the theory of evolution, because, in The Origin of Species, Darwin wrote, "If numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. This blow that Darwin so feared is dealt by the Cambrian period, right at the beginning of the fossil record."
It was only the more confusing when they realized that mammoths and mastodons were not the same thing as elephants. Once they realized what fossils were, they started looking for them. And the more they looked, the more they found, and what they found was different than anything still around. Then they found this. 90 feet deep in a Dutch quarry. and thus obviously very old, much, much older than mammoths or mastodons. Some thought it was a breathing fish because they used to think that whales were fish. And it certainly was big enough to be a whale. Others recognized it as reptilian and decided that it must be a crocodile. But there aren't any crocodiles in Europe, and no one had ever seen a crocodile as big as a whale. And when they figured out what it really was, it was even stranger than they thought. It wasn't a dinosaur. It'd be another 50 years before the first dinosaur discovery. No, this was a lizard, an actual lizard. But it was 40 feet long. And its fingers had been fused into flippers, just like on whales or sea turtles. So it lived in the water all the time. There's nothing like this alive today. Now, how is it that when men were sailing and whaling all over the world that no one had seen an actual sea monster such as this thing was? You can't miss something like this, especially not when it has to stay so close to the surface to breathe. So if anything like it was still around, we'd have found them everywhere, and they'd have found us. They'd be taking more human lives than sharks ever did. These magnificent monsters were obviously completely extinct. Imagine the gravity of this discovery on top of everything we already knew about the layers of life in the geologic column. And soon after, of course, they found plesiosaurs and pterosaurs and ichthyosaurs and dinosaurs, along with ammonites and trilobites and quasi-mammalian reptilian things that were all obviously extinct, found deeper in older strata than the more familiar fauna. And these early scientists wondered why there was no hint of humanity below the topmost layers. This was literally a revelation that
this planet doesn't belong to us.
Then Aron spends a few minutes talking about extinct animals, which perhaps, or maybe supposedly disproves the flood somehow, or maybe it's just a red herring to lengthen the video. I can't say for sure. I'll just move on to the next clip.
Imagine what an earth-shattering realization that must have been for those pioneers. Remember that these people previously believed in the Noachian flood fable, which said that all the animals on the earth, everything that had nostrils to breathe the breath of life, came to Noah to be saved. But then we discovered an earlier world that was already gone long before then, with animals that couldn't have been on the ark and couldn't have played any part in that tale.
In this short clip, instead of disproving the flood, Aron calls it a fable, which seems to be an indication of the weakness of his argument. Don't just assert that it's a fable, prove it. This is over 4 minutes into the video, and I haven't seen any compelling evidence yet. And then he seems to create a straw man. The biblical account doesn't indicate that every animal which ever existed, which breathed the breath of life, was on the ark. So if there were animals which were extinct prior to the flood, it's irrelevant to the conversation.
Most people's knowledge of paleofauna is limited to a few plastic pieces in a prehistoric playset. They have no idea how rich the fossil record is. There's hundreds of species just of dinosaurs, and 15,000 species of trilobites, among many other lineages that you've never even heard of because there aren't any left. There are so many genera represented in the fossil record that the millions of species we have now are only about 1% of what there used to be. And there isn't just the primordial world and then the world of men. There are several successive stages, punctuated by a series of mass extinctions, where life rebounded with a proliferation of new forms every time, and the entirety of human history is only the last moment of the history of life on Earth. Early scientists recognized these different periods by the type of fossils found in particular strata. In other areas where some strata were eroded, they used these as index fossils to provide relative dates as to what was Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, and so on. Very distinctly different eras. We never find trilobites where there are fossils of mammals, nor dinosaurs above the KT-Iridium boundary, and no bunnies in what would otherwise be recognized as Cambrian rock. But creationists try to include every extinct animal they know about and squeeze them all into a boat that was already overloaded before they try to add any fossil forms. Believers can't allow or admit any earlier world without men, much less any succession of them. So they imagine everything at every age all living at the same time.
There's a lot to unpack in this section. First, I want to mention that given a bunch of information that is irrelevant to the purpose of refuting Noah's flood, is a red herring and doesn't add anything to the argument, such as how many species of dinosaurs there were, or how many animals are extinct. What does that have to do with the flood? It gives the appearance that it's moving the argument forward, but in actuality, it shows the weakness of the argument.
There are several successive stages, punctuated by a series of mass extinctions, where life rebounded with a proliferation of new forms every time, and the entirety of human history is only the last moment of the history of life on Earth.
This statement is begging the question. Extinctions were followed by life rebounding with new life forms every time. And the entire existence of human history is the last moment of the history of life on this earth. Where's the evidence for this?
Early scientists recognized these different periods by the type of fossils found in particular strata. In other areas where some strata were eroded, they used these as index fossils to provide relative dates as to what was Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, and so on. Very distinctly different eras.
Here's more circularity. So scientists use the fossils within the rock to date the rock, but sometimes there may be the same fossil in different layers. Well, then they use index fossils to date the strata. And then they turn around and date fossils by which rock they're in. And worse yet, they then try to use this to show the validity of evolution.
Circular reasoning, Latin, circulus in probando, circle in proving, also known as circular logic, is a logical fallacy in which the reasoner begins with what they are trying to end with. The components of a circular argument are often logically valid, because if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Circular reasoning is not a formal logical fallacy, but a pragmatic defect in an argument whereby the premises are just as much in need of proof or evidence as the conclusion, and as a consequence the argument fails to persuade. Other ways to express this are that there is no reason to accept the premises unless one already believes the conclusion, or that the premises provide no independent ground or evidence for the conclusion. Begging the question is closely related to circular reasoning, and in modern usage the two generally refer to the same thing. Circular reasoning is often of the form, A is true because B is true. B is true because A is true.
Another thing I want to add about these index fossils is that sometimes what the experts consider to be index fossils are found alive. Here's a quote from Michael Pittman from the book Adam and Evolution. Most of the species of maidenhair are extinct. Indeed, they served as index fossils for their strata until one was found alive. The youngest fossil, Coelacanth, is about 60 million years old. Since one was discovered off Madagascar, they are no longer claimed as index fossils. Fossils which tell you that all other fossils in that layer are the same ripe old age. Walt Brown writes this in his book, In the Beginning. Before coelacanths were caught, evolutionists incorrectly believed that the coelacanths had lungs, a large brain, and four bottom fins about to evolve into legs. Evolutionists reasoned that coelacanths or similar fish crawled out of shallow sea and filled its lungs with air, becoming the first four-legged land animal. Millions of students have been incorrectly taught that this fish was the ancestor of all amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals, including people. J.L.B. Smith, a well-known fish expert from South Africa, studied the first two captured coelacanths, nicknamed the coelacanths' old forelegs, and wrote a book by that title in 1956. When dissected, did they have lungs and a large brain? Not at all. Furthermore, in 1987, a German team filmed 6 coelacanths in their natural habitat. They were not crawling on all fours. Before living coelacanths were found in 1938, evolutionists dated any rock containing a coelacanth fossil at least 70 million years old. It was an index fossil. Today, evolutionists frequently express amazement that coelacanth fossils look so much like captured coelacanths, despite more than 70 million years of evolution. If that age is correct, billions of coelacanths would have lived and died. Some should have been fossilized in younger rock and should be displayed in museums. Their absence implies that coelacanths have not lived for 70 million years.
But creationists try to include every extinct animal they know about and squeeze them all into a boat that was already overloaded before they tried to add any fossil forms.
Here, Aron Ra uses another straw man argument by saying that creationists try to fit all extinct animals onto Noah's Ark. He also calls it a boat and says it was overloaded. These are all baseless assertions. He would need to prove that the Ark was overloaded. And these logical fallacies are adding up. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the title of the video should be changed, as I haven't seen a shred of proof that disproves Noah's flood.
Believers can't allow or admit any earlier world without men, much less any succession of them. So they imagine everything at every age all living at the same time. It's like the original King Kong in 1933, because Stegosaurus lived 80 million years before Tyrannosaurus, which lived 60 million years before anything resembling a gorilla. We know this because scientists can now find absolute ages by using a variety of radiometric dating methods, which are all much more precise.
Here, Aron Ra makes a claim that scientists can find absolute ages by using a variety of radiometric dating methods, which are all much more precise. Let's examine that claim. Here's an article from Dr. Andrew Snelling, who has a PhD in paleontology, about radioactive dating failure. First, let's take a look at the assumptions radioactive dating is based upon. Number one, when the rock forms or hardens, there should be only parent radioactive atoms in the rock and no daughter radiogenic atoms. Number two, after hardening, the rock must remain in a closed system. That is, no parent or daughter atoms should be added to or removed from the rock by external influences such as percolating groundwaters. And number three, the radioactive decay rate must remain constant. If any of these assumptions are violated, then the technique fails and any dates are false. Potassium-argon dates. 11 samples were collected from 5 recent lava flows during field work in January 1996, 2 each from the February 11, 1949, June 4, 1954, and July 14, 1954 flows, and from the February 19, 1975 avalanche deposits, and 3 from the June 30, 1954 flow. The samples were sent progressively in batches to Geochron Laboratories in Cambridge, Boston, for whole rock potassium-argon dating. First, a piece of one sample from each flow, then a piece of the second sample from each flow after the first set of results was received, and finally, a piece of the third sample from the June 30, 1954 flow. To also test the consistency of results within samples, second pieces of 2 of the June 30, 1954 lava samples were also sent for analysis. Geochron is a respected commercial laboratory, the KAR lab manager having a PhD in KAR dating. No specific location or expected age information was supplied to the laboratory. However, the samples were described as probably young, with very little argon in them, so as to ensure extra care was taken during the analytical work. The dates obtained from the KAR analysis are listed in Table 1. The ages range from 0.27 to 3.5 million years for rocks which were observed to have cooled from lavas 25 through 50 years ago. One sample from each flow yields ages of 0.27 or 0.29 million years, while all the other samples gave ages of millions of years. Conclusion. The radioactive potassium-argon dating method has been demonstrated to fail on 1949, 1954, and 1975 lava flows at Mount Nauru-Hui, New Zealand, in spite of the quality of the laboratory's KAR analytical work. Argon gas brought up from deep inside the earth within the molten rock was already present in the lavas when they cooled. We know the true ages of the rocks because they were observed to form less than 50 years ago. yet they yield ages up to 3.5 million years, which are thus false. How can we trust the use of the same dating on rocks whose ages we don't know? If the method fails on rocks when we have an independent eyewitness account, then why should we trust it on the other rocks where there are no independent historical cross-checks?
We need to understand how these methods work so we can find out the answer to that question. First of all, they're based on the occurrence of radioactive atoms of different elements in rocks. For example, some atoms of uranium decay to lead over time. Atoms of potassium, some atoms decay to argon. Rubidium decays to strontium. And we call them parent atoms decay to daughter atoms. Well, what most people don't realise is that there are three basic assumptions that are always used, and none of these assumptions are either testable or provable. Let's run through these assumptions. Number one, that we know the starting conditions. Well, the geologists assume that there are only parent atoms to begin with. Well, if there were some daughters, they think of ways to measure that and figure it out. But really, we don't know because we weren't there to know exactly what the starting conditions were. Number two, they have to assume that all the daughter atoms we measure today have been derived by radioactive decay of the parent atoms in the rock. But how do we know? What about contamination? What if groundwater flowed through the rocks in the past, adding or subtracting some of the parent or daughter atoms? So that's another problem. And the third assumption is that the rate of decay has always been constant. In other words, we measure how quickly uranium decays to lead today, potassium to argon, and then the geologists have assumed that that's the decay rate back into the past. So because uranium decays very slowly, they assume it's always decayed very slowly. Now, that again is not testable because we weren't there in the past to see whether the clocks have always ticked at the same rate. And geologists don't always admit to these problems and recognise them. Now, I was involved in a major research project and we found several lines of evidence that led us to the conclusion that the decay rates were much more rapid in the past, that they were accelerated, and therefore the clocks tick so much faster that the millions of years ages telescope right down to short young ages. And so, for example, we took rock samples from the same samples from the same rock layers and subjected them to several of the dating methods all at once. And we got different results for the different dating methods. Now, how could that be? Well, we discovered, as we did with several other lines of evidence, that the best explanation, indeed the only explanation, is that the decay rates were faster in the past. So that while the potassium-argon clock ticked through 516 million years, the rubidium-strontium clock ticked through 1111 million years. And so if the decay rate hasn't been constant in the past, that means the clocks are wrong, and therefore we can't trust these radioactive dating methods.
And that's not the only problem with Noah's Ark. According to every ounce of paleontological evidence anyone has ever dug up, there is every indication that the further back in time you look, the simpler and more similar living things appear to be, until there are only single cells, and this Proterozoic era accounts for more than 80% of the history of life on this planet. There were no primates 100 million years ago, no mammals 200 million years ago, no dinosaurs 300 million years ago, and no land animals whatsoever 400 million years ago. 500 million years ago, there weren't any insects or vertebrates with actual bones, and 600 million years ago, there weren't even the most primitive fish yet. We've never found any trace fossils for macroscopic life forms prior to 700 million years ago, but we do have bacterial microfossils covering another 2.8 billion years prior to the first multicellular anythings we've ever found a trace of. Prior to that, there is no evident life of any kind at all.
What are all of these dates based on? The circularity of getting the dates based on evolutionary theory, which is used to date the fossils, then use that date to date the rocks, and turn around and date other fossils based on the date of the rocks? Or are you using the radiometric dating methods, which can't even corroborate the date of the other methods? And they date 50-year-old rocks millions of years old. You want to use that to try and disprove Noah's flood?
Good luck.
Creationist pseudoscience is particularly popular in the U.S. Few Americans know that during the Cretaceous period, when the world was a bit warmer than it is today and there were no ice caps at either pole, our continent was divided by a western interior seaway, such that several states, including Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, were all entirely underwater. If there were any mountains in Colorado then, they would have been islands, because this sea was hundreds of meters deep in some places. How do we know that? Well, I myself took a trip to a Cretaceous beach near the Texas-Oklahoma border, where a river has cut a path through the strata deep enough to reveal a place where thousands of ammonite shells have apparently washed along this ancient shore together. The oldest ammonites, like those of the Paleozoic, had straight conical shells, but what we found here were the more recent type of spiral shell that are common in the Cretaceous. Though this was once a beach, this sea has since receded, and the area was eventually buried in at least two successive formations accumulating over millions of years afterward. Similar finds in different places as compared to other areas that never show any marine deposits at all led to paleo maps like this one. So we know there was a sea here, and that it didn't cover everything. So how do we know how deep the western interior seaway was? Well, the depth was variable at different times depending on temperature and tectonics. As I said, it would ebb and flow.
Aside from the ad hominem attack, his argument seems to be that there wasn't a flood, but just a sea that covered large parts of the land, because marine life wasn't found everywhere.
Similar finds in different places as compared to other areas that never show any marine deposits at all. So we know there was a sea here, and that it didn't cover everything.
That's a non sequitur. It doesn't logically follow that because marine life wasn't evenly distributed or found everywhere, that means that there wasn't a flood. You would have to prove, there's that word again, that a flood would cause marine life to be distributed evenly.
But we do have a few clues, starting with coral formations. Corals testify not only to an old Earth, but to the lack of a global flood.
At this point, Aron talks for a few minutes about evidence for an old Earth, which seems to drift off topic a little, so I'll ignore the red herring and go to the next clip.
Firstly, corals do not tolerate flood conditions very well. Floods kick up particles into the water, dust and sand and clay, for example, and these sediments often take many years to completely settle out of the water and not only kill living corals, but prevent growth of new corals until the particles have settled out. Now, the biblical flood would certainly have followed modern flood conditions and thusly killing all of the coral around the globe.
That's another logical fallacy. It's called a hasty generalization. Hasty generalization is an informal fallacy of faulty generalization by reaching an inductive generalization based on insufficient evidence. Essentially, making a rushed conclusion without considering all of the variables. There is no way Aron could know that all coral reefs died as a result of the flood, or hypothetically, that they would have died as a result. This is just pure speculation and conjecture.
Now remember what I showed you in the previous video of the series? At more than 2,000 meters above where the sea level is today, the Guadalupe mountain range is the highest elevation in Texas, a state that was once entirely submerged in the western interior seaway. You're looking at a fossilized coral formation several miles long and nearly 1,000 meters above the land around it, which indicates the relative depth of the western interior seaway in this place at that time. At the very fastest that any coral can grow, even in exceptionally ideal conditions, which would not be the case in a cataclysmic global flood, realize that it would still take several thousand years at a minimum to build this reef. That's several thousand years with the sea level up there. Yet creationists expect us to believe that all of this was formed under impossible strangulating turbulence when the water was only at that depth for a few weeks at most? This is not possible. No part of Noah's flood is. Under normal conditions, in reality, this formation would have taken more than 100,000 years to form in a seaway that evidently ebbed and surged here for more than 100 million years.
This is a forced dichotomy fallacy, where two views are presented as if it's an exhaustive list of views. So Aron puts forth two views. One, the coral formation formed over thousands of years in the present location, or it formed over the span of a year in the present location. But the coral could have been deposited into the present location from a previous location where it formed.
And creationists like to point to the Grand Canyon as though that could support their fable. And while it may seem at first like it's easy for a flood to carve out such a geologic formation, there are problems that arise when you look deeper into the paleontological record of these deposits. For instance, there are land-formed sediments, including the Coconino sandstone, desert-formed sand dunes right in the middle of where creationists imagined their flood should be. This inconvenient truth has prompted creationists to rationalize whatever excuse they can to explain how desert sand dunes could have formed during the receding stage of their flood. However, these sediments contain fossil footprints that could only have come from small animals climbing on the sides of these Permian sand dunes, now sandstones. These dunes needed to be slightly damp, like morning dew, in order to allow such prints to form. However, any deluge would have destroyed not only the footprints, but also the dunes themselves, as well as any vertebrate trying to make such tracks. Institute for Creation Research geologist Dr. Steve Austin suggested the prints were made by amphibians resting between the dunes that were underwater. But that's rather implausible, as the flood was supposed to have been so catastrophic that it would have destroyed the dunes and violently dumped several meters of sediment per day over the top of them, and of course it would have killed any amphibians that were still around by that time. Remember, this is supposed to be the recessive part of the flood, and there's not any amphibians that would have survived that long. The scientific rebuttal to that also gave specifics as to how these prints can't have been made underwater.
This argument reminds me of the flaws in Aron's overall argument, that he wants to pick a few lines of evidence and infer that those few things disprove the flood. But as I stated earlier, the flood has great explanatory scope. There are multiple lines of evidence for the creation of the Grand Canyon that the flood does explain. I want to list a few of those to show that Aron's explanation for the Grand Canyon will fail to explain, and then I'll show the weakness of his two lines of evidence. Hualapai limestone, west of the Grand Canyon, was deposited before the Colorado River flowed out of the western end of the Grand Canyon. Also, many layers in the canyon consist primarily of limestone, hundreds of feet thick. What is the source of so much limestone, and what concentrated it? Almost all limestone came from the subterranean water chamber and was deposited during the flood, before the Grand Canyon formed. Side canyons. Why do Grand Canyon and Marble Canyon have so many side canyons that were cut as deeply as the main canyons but without a visible source of water? Subsurface water released by faulting and the rapid downcutting of Marble Canyon and Grand Canyon far below the high post-flood water table carved dozens of large side canyons. They in turn released groundwater on their flanks. Missing dirt. About 2,800 cubic miles of dirt had to be removed to carve the Grand Canyon. The Colorado River's delta does not contain even 1% of that dirt. Where did it go? Was there enough water to transport all that dirt? At least 2,000 cubic miles of Mesozoic sediments were stripped off the layers surrounding and above what is now the Grand Canyon. There was plenty of water to transport all of that dirt downstream from the Grand Canyon, primarily into the northernmost 220 miles of the Gulf of California. Perpendicular faults. Why are the dozens of faults in the Grand Canyon generally perpendicular to the Colorado River? And why doesn't the river flow along an easier path provided by a fault? Maybe the faults formed as a result of and after the deep erosion that formed the river's channel. Arching. Why are Grand and Marble Canyons cut into and along the top of a broad upward pointing arch that extends in general for the 277-mile length of those canyons? inner gorge? Why are the walls of the inner gorge so deep, steep, narrow, and rough? How could a river cut so deeply into such hard rock at the inner gorge, but not as deeply into softer rock, both upstream and downstream? Why here? Why is the Grand Canyon where it is? And why are there not many other Grand Canyons worldwide? The canyon receives little rain. If an explanation claims that a set of conditions such as fast-flowing river in millions of years produced the Grand Canyon, then dozens of other Grand Canyons should exist where those conditions are even more extreme. Why so recently? If the Grand Canyon was carved during the last 1,000th of Earth's history, why were no other Grand Canyons carved earlier? And we can go on and on with this sort of thing here. But now let's move on to Aron's two other lines of evidence.
These were myths, and I'd like to introduce you to a few of these things today. So first of all, the Coconino is a third layer down in the Grand Canyon. It's often used as proof against Noah's flood. There's other sandstones like this around the world. Here in the United States, in Europe, and in other places, there's some sandstones that are very similar to this. The Coconino is used as the big example to try to explain all these sandstones. Most geologists think that this sandstone was deposited in a desert. You can see the angled layers in this sandstone, and those layers are supposed to be the backsides of wind-blown sand dunes. And so over and over again, people have used this as an example to say that the Coconino was deposited in a desert and that Noah's flood cannot possibly be true. What do sand dunes look like? Sand dunes have these very steep angles on them. They're at about 32 to 34 degrees, and you can see that steep slope down the sand dune there. And what happens in real life as sand builds up in a wind-blown environment, sand begins to avalanche down that sand dune. And this is called the angle of repose. And this is the model that most secular scientists believe the Coconino represents. We have these steep crossbeds in the Coconino, and they think that these represent these avalanche deposits that occur in modern sand dunes. Now, you can have sand dunes that are underwater as well, and towards the end of the presentation today, I'll show you some examples of those. But this is what most secular geologists think about when they study sand dunes like the Coconino. So here are some of the myths of the Coconino. And myth number one, the fossilized sand dunes in the Coconino are steep like those found in modern deserts. And over again in the literature, you find these quotes about how steep the crossbeds are in the Coconino. And here's just a couple quotes from some prominent authors. I won't read those to you, but they keep talking about these high-angle crossbeds. Well, we did something brilliant. We started measuring crossbed angles, and it's fairly simple to measure those. Geologists learn how to do that in introductory geology classes. And we measured all these crossbed dips in the Coconino, and guess what? They aren't steep. They only average about 20 degrees. They aren't anywhere close to the angles that you find in modern deserts, which are around 32 to 34 degrees. And so this is myth number one. The Coconino does not have steep crossbed dips. The crossbed dips are fairly shallow. Myth number two. Most authors will say that the Coconino has very well-rounded sand grains. And again, here's a couple authors, some of them rather prominent, and they say that the Coconino grains are rounded. Now, why do they say that? Well, their assumption is that the Coconino was deposited in a desert. And as sand grains get blown around in the desert, they run into each other, they hit each other. And it breaks the corners off of the sand grains, and the sand grains become rounded. Especially larger sand grains become rounded. And so I think what happened is most geologists assumed that this was a desert deposit, and since it was a desert deposit, it must have round sand grains, and so they published it had round sand grains. But I don't believe they ever looked at the sand grains under the microscope. And when we started looking at Coconino sand grains, we found that the sand grains were fairly angular. And here's a way that geologists measure the angularity of sand grains. You can measure it on a scale from 0 to 6. And the 5 to 6 there, the range of 5 to 6, those are very well-rounded sand grains. And when we made all our measurements, we found that the average rounding was somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5. So not very well-rounded. In fact, a lot of the Coconino grains are angular. And here's what the Coconino sandstone looks like under the microscope. The blue stuff is pore space in there, but the white grains and the yellow grains, those are sand grains. And you can see they have fairly sharp edges and they're angular. And this is not something that you would expect to find in a desert. So myth number 2, the Coconino is well-rounded. And we've looked at hundreds of slides under the microscope, and this is very typical of what the Coconino represents. Myth number 3, the sand grains of the Coconino are well sorted. And what happens in modern desert deposits is wind picks up sand, blows it along, and puts it in a pile. And most of the sand in sand dunes is pretty well sorted. And what that means is that all the sand grains are about the same size. And so when we began collecting samples of the Coconino and looking at it under the microscope, this is the expectation that we had, because here it is, published in the literature, that the Coconino is well sorted. But as we began to look at the thin sections under the microscope and make measurements on them and so on, again, we did not find that it was well sorted. In fact, we found that it was somewhere between poorly sorted and moderately sorted. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details of how I made all these measurements. You can look in the Answers Research Journal last December to find out how we did that. But again, the Coconino is not very well sorted. There's a myth out there that this sandstone is well sorted because they think it was made in a desert, and in fact it's not. And here's an example of what some of the Coconino looks like. And I think that you can see right away from looking at this image that there's a wide range of grain sizes. Now, you don't see this in every single thin section, but here's an example of a very poorly sorted piece of Coconino. Again, this is not something that you would expect to see in a desert. And lastly, we do have a model for how we think that these crossbeds were made. We think that these crossbeds actually represent underwater sand waves. And there's several famous places in the world where sand waves have been found. One is the entrance to San Francisco Bay in California. And these are fairly large sand waves. They're about 25 feet high or so. They have about 20-degree angles or right around there on them. And so we think this is a very good model for the deposition of the Coconino. Of course, it forms underwater by very strong currents. And this is Long Island Sound. Long Island Sound has the same kinds of features. And to give you an idea how big these features are, that little black rectangular speck right there, that's a shipwreck. An 80-meter shipwreck. That's the size of a football field right there, that little shipwreck. And so these sand waves are very, very big features. So the moral of the story today is don't believe everything you read in the scientific literature. If you aren't seeing original research there and aren't seeing some good original data, it may be false, and maybe people are getting some of this data from just because of their presupposition of what they think the rock layer or the formation or whatever else you're talking about is. They're talking about some data that might not really be there. So encourage you to always try to go back and look at the original research, and if it's not there, get out and do it. So thank you very much.
And speaking of fossil footprints and mud, creationists have pointed to the Paluxy River Formation in Glen Rose, Texas as evidence for dinosaurs walking alongside humans. In their view, this lends credence to the idea not only that the Earth is young, but that dinosaurs were alive and included on the Ark. The formation is a famous dinosaur trackway where a group of theropod dinosaurs walked through soft mud. However, in certain areas the tracks seem to be accompanied by human footprints. Yet, when examined in greater detail, these tracks do not stand up to creationist claims. The dinosaurs that walked through this area had three-toed footprints. In many of the tracks, the entire foot is clearly evident. In other tracks, however, the shallower parts of the imprint have been filled in or eroded away thanks to the soft waves of the river nearby. And this gives the impression that the footprints were made by a human and not by a dinosaur. Further putting a kink in the creationist claims, this entire trackway would not be possible if there was a cataclysmic worldwide flood. As previously discussed, trackways need calm conditions of gradual sedimentation over their surface to be preserved, not a sudden deluge of unsorted flood debris.
Now, I'm not an expert in psychology. In the field of psychology, cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort experienced by a person who simultaneously holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values. This discomfort is triggered by a situation in which a person's belief clashes with new evidence perceived by that person. When confronted with facts that contradict personal beliefs, ideals, and values, people will find a way to resolve the contradiction in order to reduce their discomfort. If you ask me, the little print looks like a human print. But for argument's sake, let's just remove any discomfort and say that it's not a human print. You have numerous accounts in different societies in the past which describe animals which sound an awful lot like dinosaurs. Not to mention, we actually have ancient art which depicts what looks to be dinosaurs. The evidence seems to point to the fact that humans and dinosaurs live together.
On to the fossil species themselves. Flood believers claim that modern species were derived from relatively few kinds that were magically created unrelated to anything else. However, they've never been able to show how to identify any of these kinds in order to remove them from the parent category shared with other kinds.
Aron made two assertions in this section. Number one, flood believers believe that modern species were derived from relatively few kinds that were magically created. And two, they've never been able to show how to identify any of these kinds. I don't want to call Aron Ra a liar for making these four statements. Perhaps he's just ignorant of the facts. I'll take this time to provide the facts. So, to the first claim, I would say that creationists don't believe that modern species were magically created, but that God created the different kind. Evolutionists actually believe that living things came from non-living things. That would actually seem like magic to me. Regarding the second claim, I'll quote from Henry M. Morris in the book The Biblical Basis for Modern Science. Consequently, creationists do not necessarily hold to the fixity of species as evolutionists claim they do. In the early days of biology, practically all biologists were creationists, and their purpose in working out their biological classification system was certainly not to show any imagined evolutionary connections, but to identify evidence of order and design in created things. Caluus Linnaeus in 1735 tried to identify the species as a natural, stable, interbreeding unit, which he assumed to be identical with the Genesis kind. Many years later, after much further research, he decided that this was too narrow a definition, so he didn't define the genus as more or less the equivalent to the kind. In recent years, scientific creationists have attempted to define the biblical kind in various ways, though none define it as narrowly as a species category. Probably, most would say that no single category always fits, so that sometimes the kind is the species, sometimes the genus, sometimes the family. Even evolutionist taxonomists have differed widely from each other as to the exact nature and limits of species or genus, for example.
Genesis says that Noah was supposed to take every air-breathing land animal aboard the ark, so we can predict that the fossil record should contain both extinct and modern species. But if the world was created 6,000 years ago and the flood happened 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, as believers say, then why would God want to save all these species only to see more than 90% of them become extinct immediately as soon as they got off the boat? Obviously, the ark did not save them.
If 90% of species are extinct, it would actually make sense if only 2 of each kind was taken on the ark. If things didn't go right, then the animal could easily go extinct. So, despite Aaron thinking that this is a good argument, it actually helps to prove Noah's flood. It has predictive power. If the flood happened, as outlined in the Bible, and Noah took two of each kind, then I predict that a large percentage of the creatures could go extinct if things didn't go right. Say, for instance, one of the two died before reproducing. And that's exactly what we see.
Very few modern species or genera have any presence in the fossil record at all. Even so-called living fossils are not much like their ancestors. The living coelacanths, two species, are so different from their fossil predecessors, they're not even in the same taxonomic family.
I'm actually surprised that Aaron Rod just said what I heard. The coelacanths are so different from their fossil predecessor that it is in a different taxonomic family. Would that be because the modern version had been evolving for 70 million years? Or because they were index fossils, and so because of evolutionary assumptions, it can't be in the same class? This is circular reasoning, which has been consistent throughout this video.
Importantly, floods leave telltale signs behind, and animals unfortunate enough to become caught up in their waters and killed will be deposited mixed up with all the debris. When this happens, they do not sort themselves out into nice layers like the fossil record shows. Floods are a jumbled mess of indistinct sediments, often with smaller things floating above larger ones. Never has a single ammonite been found in strata that also has the fossils of horses, indicating that ammonites went extinct before mammals. And they did not live at the same time, therefore they could not have died in the same global flood.
Okay, let me see if I can explain this. If you start with the assumption that evolution is true, then you will begin with the presupposition that ammonites didn't live at the same time as horses. But because those are your starting assumptions, doesn't make it a fact. Again, the title of the video says How Paleontology Disproves the Flood, which implies some type of evidence will be presented, not presuppositions and not assumptions.
If the global flood had really happened, nothing would look like it does. There wouldn't be any geologic column with layers of strata with different radiometric dates and consistent index fossils or transitional species, of which there are many. Instead, we would find the bones of people and cattle mixed together with dimetrodons and velociraptors in a poorly sorted jumble of large and small grains, rather than distinct layers of different types of deposition requiring different amounts of time to accumulate.
How does Aaron Rod know what the world would look like if there were no flood? How would he know how it would look if there were a flood? The answer is he can't know. He's not omniscient. This is just more speculation and conjecture.
Noah's flood was postulated to be absolute. Genesis 7:23 says, God blotted every living thing off the face of the ground, which implies that there shouldn't be any record of aquatic species in the fossil record at all. Yet there are, and in some cases quite clearly and beautifully so.
This is bad exegesis of the text. The word ground can be interpreted as land. It doesn't say water or sea, but land. In fact, if you review verses 21 and 22, which precede verse 23, the text is very explicit. It says, every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. It doesn't say fish or any sea animals.
Creationists have to assume so many miracles to keep their animals alive through their great flood.
That's a straw man argument. Does it take miracles to keep animals alive? They would only need to do what they've always done, just in a different environment. Now, on the other hand, Aaron Ra has to assume evolution. He has to use circular reasoning to date his fossils, which he'll turn and use to date the rocks, which he'll turn again to date the other fossils by the rocks. And if that doesn't work, then he'll use faulty radiometric data, which they'll throw out any results that don't match their assumed position.
whatever he does to wipe out only the few tribes that pissed him off without having the need to drown every innocent fawn and kill every cute kitten around the world, and without any need for this absurdly impossible floating zoo.
Aron calls Noah's Ark an absurdly impossible floating zoo, as if this is sound argumentation and somehow proves his position. But it doesn't. It shows the weakness of his position. It's sort of like an ad hominem when you attack the person rather than the argument. Let's just substitute a good argument with supporting evidence for calling the Ark an absurdly impossible floating zoo. Good job.
Any other idea would have been better than a global flood. And
Any idea would have been better than a flood. Says who? So I'm just supposed to take your word for it because Aaron Ross says it, then it must be true. No, I don't think so. How about you prove it?
paleontology proves not only that Noah's flood couldn't happen, but that even if it could happen, we know for certain that it didn't happen.
Paleontology proved it? Are you sure? Because the video didn't back up that assertion. You know for certain. The only thing you know for certain is that you exist. That's it. You don't even know for certain that your senses are reliable or that your reason is reliable.